Okay, so your bibliography is due today, right? I've got about, I'd say half of them have come in already. And a bunch of people who emailed me over the weekend got answers back to their questions. Probably not answer an email after I get home tonight. Just, I've been here since like 8 this morning. So it's probably not happening. You can still try me if it's an absolutely crucial thing. But like I said before, don't wait until the very last minute for that. I'm happy to help if you give me enough time to do it. Let's see, what else? Worksheet 4 was due last week. I got that back to you, right? Did I do worksheet? I haven't given you worksheet 4 back. Yes, I did. Yeah. Gosh, I'm ahead of myself. Worksheet 5 will probably come due early next week since I haven't had a chance to notify you yet, right? I got to look at the schedule. We're running a bit behind. We'll probably be able to make up the time, but it's because of the explanation that we gave for the bibliography last week. And the time that we spent sort of going over things like that have sort of slowed us down a little bit. But it's not the end of the world, and we should be able to catch up. And also, as you guys have probably figured out, this stuff's my favorite, so it takes me longer to get through it than anything else because I like it so much. And there's other things that I kind of detest, and so I tend to speed through that a bit more quickly. And I can do that because it's my class, right? If you don't like it, get a PhD, teach your own class, right? And then you can focus on whatever you want instead. I get to focus on what I want. So, back to the art today, full bore. We don't have anything else to go over today, I don't think. I'd like to try to schedule a field trip, and so I'm going to work on getting the doodle poll up sort of thing when people can go. It's a little difficult given people's class schedules and the fact that they aren't open at night, right? It's a government institution, so they close at 5, which means we can go during class, but we're sitting outside like this, trying to look through the windows, and that wouldn't get us very far. So, but we'll see. Maybe there's a weekend that people can go, or maybe during one of those common ground times that they have, in the middle of the day on Tuesday, Friday, we can figure out a time that maybe we can go. So, because it's worthwhile seeing these things firsthand, and it was just sort of extracurricular sort of thing. Okay, let's wrap up 15th century Low Countries, what we call late Gothic. We were looking at Jan van Eyck, and we saw a really terrific part of a triptych downtown at the National Gallery. Remember, this was the left wing of a folding triptych, right? Originally folded over, a lost centerpiece, a lost right wing, and they may well have been painted on the back as well, but those don't survive either, right? And then we were also looking at the second Annunciation by Jan van Eyck in the Ghent altarpiece on the outside of that triptych as well, or polyptych, because each of the wings is made of multiple panels. And what we saw with both of these is the degree to which Van Eyck emphasizes details. And that is, in fact, what we'll see today is a hallmark of other artists working in the Netherlands in the 15th century, is this commitment to detailed rendering of closely observed things in nature. So Van Eyck's not the only one. He's perhaps, however, the best insofar as his manipulation of oil paint to achieve a realistic effect, which is why he got the reputation of having invented oil paint, even though he didn't. Right? So we're going to look at another Annunciation by a contemporary of Jan van Eyck, Robert Campan. Probably slightly older than Van Eyck and lives a little bit longer. Van Eyck dies in 1441, and Campan lives all the way to the late 40s. And here we see another triptych, hinged, around the central panel. This one's up in the Metropolitan Museum. We've got a School of Robert Campan piece in the National Gallery. By that I mean a piece by one of his pupils in the National Gallery, but it's nowhere near as good as this one. But Campan did run a very large workshop, which we'll see. And so here our triptych gives us the Annunciation one more time. So this is about the 5th Annunciation we've seen, isn't it? We've seen quite a few Annunciation scenes. As you might imagine, the birth of Christ, right? The announcing of the birth of Christ would be a very popular subject for Christians in the 15th century. And in this case, the angel comes in again from the left. The wings on either side, we'll talk mostly about the one on the right, but the one on the left are the people who paid for it, right? The donors, the patrons. And just like the Ghent altarpiece showed us the donors down below, right? And just as we saw a crucifixion scene with the Carthusian monk at the foot of the cross, right? Here are donors have gotten pretty exclusive access to the scene. So there's this door that's opened up. And you can even see, if you look in the center panel, along the left edge of the center panel, you see the opening of the door, right? So they're looking in, right? They're following the angel into the room. If the angel walked through the doorway, right? Which is, angels don't have to do that sort of thing. But they're looking in, right? The fact that the door doesn't quite line up with the door jamb is one of many pieces of evidence that make us think that the left-hand panel was added later, right? That maybe Robert Campan had the Annunciation in his shop already, and they came in and said, ooh, I want that, and had him paint the panel on the left to go with it. That's a possibility, right? There are two coats of arms in the window in the center, and they're probably the coats of arms of the two families represented by the husband and wife. See those at the top part of the window, those little pieces of stained glass? Those are family coats of arms, right? Okay, let's look at the Annunciation a little closer. What does it share with the Ghent altarpiece? It's interesting to see these side by side. We know that they met at one point, but we don't know how well they knew each other, and they're working in different cities. Do you see anything similar? I know it's been a while since we talked about the Ghent altar. Do you see anything similar in Campan's Marode triptych that reminds us of something that we saw in the Ghent altarpiece? Obviously, the players are the same, right? Angel coming in, kneeling. The Virgin on the right, also on the ground in both of them, a symbol of her humility, right? But what else do we see that's the same in both of these? Abby, what? The window's looking out, so we've got a window that shows us the world outside. What are you talking about here? Is that what you're talking about, Abby?
Oh, I was looking at the
right, so we've got a window behind the Virgin in each one of them looking out onto the world outside, right?
And which is in that one too. The third piece.
The third piece, right. So there's this idea of these windows that show us the world beyond, and in fact, I don't have a detail to show you that. I should, and I don't, just because we're running behind. But if you go in tight, this is the Metropolitan Museum. This is at the Cloisters Collection in New York, which is a satellite of the Met. And there's a contemporary city outside, just like there is here in Van Eyck, right? A city that looks like 15th century Netherlands. Right? The buildings, some of them still survive today. Okay? So great, we've got the window in the back that shows us a contemporary world beyond. What else do we have that's shared between the two? What else do we see that is similar to each other? Good, I got two things. So over here I heard the books. She's reading a book in each one of them. I'll come back to yours in a second, okay? She's reading a book in each one of them. You'll notice it's on the little, they call it a prie-dieu, a pray to God, right? Her little podium, right? Over here. And there she's holding it, but you'll notice that she has actually three books in the Marode piece. She's holding one. There's one on the table with its pages glowing, just like this one is in the Ghent altarpiece. And there's a third text coming off of the table, which is in the form of a scroll, right? So I like this idea that she's not just reading, she's studying, right? It's like you're doing your term paper, and you got all your books out there on the table, and you're using each one of them to bring a little something into your research, right? She's actually text comparing. I'll give you a second, Brendan. We have this, so in the back, yeah.
Oh, it's kind of like depth of space because they have like a kind of convergence.
Yeah, there is an attempt to give you a sort of perspective, right?
Yeah.
One of the things we'll look at later tonight is that the people up north did not have a consistent perspective scheme. Remember from worksheet number 4, talked about who invented linear perspective, right? Brunelleschi, it's Italian. But the northerners didn't have it. They're sort of intuiting the idea, but they don't use a mathematical system. The difference between the two is that you'll notice that Campan's altarpiece, or triptych, the space isn't as consistent as Van Eyck's. Across all 4 panels, that's the same space. And it seems to go back in a rational sort of way. But if we look at the center panel in the Merode, it really plunges and it kind of tips up, you know, and it makes it sort of, you know, it leaps back into space. And if you look at the top of the table, it tips up even higher, so that we can see all the stuff in the table. But Van Eyck is very good about sort of giving us that sense of going back into space rather than up into space. And if we look at the Merode and you compare the space of the center room, you'll notice that the same perspective does not govern the right-hand panel. Right? The far right wall of Joseph's room should rake in even more drastically, to the point where we can't even see those windows. Right? But it actually goes back sort of more straight. So there's not a consistency of perspective in the same way that there is with Van Eyck, to the point where you get the sense, he does this with the shadows, right? That this is just one room with the same space defined for all of it. Right.
I forget what it's called, but they each have a kettle area.
Yeah, they've got that niche in the back with the brass kettle in it. See how similar that is in each one of them? So we talked about this over here, right? Where you have the brass kettle in the basin in this Gothic church architecture with the cloth. This was a reference to where the priest prepared the sacrament, right? This is something you would see in churches in what's called the sacristy. That's where the sacrament is held, right? And the priest would, as he prepared the sacrament to present it to the congregation, right? He would wipe his hands on this and wipe his hands on the bowl. So it's this idea of consecration, right? And also the idea about preparing the body of Christ, because that's what the priest does in the Mass service, prepares the bread and the wine, which is the body and blood of Christ, according to the Mass ceremony. And here, the physical body of Christ is being prepared. So that makes that reference. Now, Campan's got almost exactly the same thing. And I don't know many other examples where we see it, which makes me think there's got to be some sort of connection between the two. But the thing is, we tend to date this a little earlier than the Ghent altarpiece, and he's working in a different city. We don't know the exact date on this. This is a circa date, because unlike Van Eyck, he didn't date anything. He didn't put his name or the dates on anything. We simply have third-party information, archival references that help us to pull it all together. Right? It's a kind of a laborious thing, how we've pulled together the works that are painted by Robert Campan. Right? So we've got these things that are similar. Let's look at some details here. Right? There's our two niches in the back that Brennan was just talking about. I love how Campan also suggested there are multiple sources of light in this room. All the shadows have 2 or 3 different shadows in them, right? And so this is really, really similar between the two of them. We have other things that are quite similar as well. We have a snuffed candlestick, or reference to one, right? Behind the Virgin Mary, there's an empty candlestick, as well as this pewter jug just over her shoulder. And in Campan, the candle's just gone out. As if, you know, the breeze that's brought in by the angel has snuffed the candle. That certainly is a reference to a theological idea that Christ is the light of the world, and that light, that supernatural light, is stronger than earthly lights, right? And we saw Van Eyck sort of playing with that same idea. And the empty candlestick behind the Virgin in the Ghent altarpiece is also reference to that, right? Lilies appear in both, and we can still barely see it above our details here on the right. The angel's carrying lilies, and here they're in a pot on the table, right? Remember that lilies are a standard symbol, one of 2 or 3 flowers that are standard symbols for the Virgin Mary, right? They're tall, she's great. They're white, she's pure. And the list goes on, right? That's just scratching the surface. What's interesting about Campan's flowers is they grow from a vase with Hebrew characters on it. I mean, they're not really Hebrew, actually. I took Hebrew as an undergrad because I wasted all of my time, right? They were on the quarter system, and you needed 180 credits to graduate. I had 310. because we didn't have advisors, and I just kept, it was cheap. This was the 70s, right? I sold a car, took another semester of class. It was like $600 a semester for in-state tuition at PSU. I kept taking classes. I liked being in school. I guess I must have because I'm not teaching, right? I'm still in school. But in any event, I took Hebrew, and those aren't really Hebrew. Some of them kind of look like Hebrew characters, but they're not precise by any means. But the point is, Virgin Mary coming out of symbol of Hebrew is kind of this idea that we saw with Van Eyck's Annunciation Downtown, which is Christianity builds on Judaism, right? Which is a strong and very popular theological concept. In this case, the flower picks up a secondary symbolism, because you'll notice that the flower has 3 buds. Right? Anytime we see things with 3s in Christian images in the Renaissance, we should immediately, but carefully, think about the Trinity. Right? So remember the 3 windows behind the Virgin Mary in the Annunciation Downtown by Van Eyck, right? Reference to 3 similar but different. In this case, since it's the Trinity and Christ hasn't yet been born, one of the 3 buds isn't open yet. Because Christ is about to be born, if you will, or about to come into being. So that's a reference specifically to that. Right? So it's a dual metaphor. It's still the Virgin Mary, yes, but it's also a symbol for the Trinity. And symbols in paintings can, in fact, take on multiple meanings. Okay? You'll also notice that Campan makes the towel that's hanging behind also look like a Jewish prayer shawl. Right? And these are all ways in which he's sort of adding to this idea of Christianity growing out of Judaism. Right? I love the observation he's put into the smoke, how it comes up straight and then goes, whoosh, as it wafts into chaos. Right? Okay, it changed on my screen. There we go. Light still coming through the window. Remember that if light can pass through a window and leave it unbroken, that's a symbol for the purity of the virgin. As the light passes into her, leaves her still a virgin. But instead of being a dove that's coming toward her, we've got a little baby Jesus body surfing down one of the rays and carrying a cross. Right? Because, of course, the whole purpose of this is that he will be sacrificed. So even at this very joyous moment, when the Virgin Mary is learning that she will be the mother to the Savior, right, the Messiah, there's this idea that, well, there's one reason he's being born, right, and that's to die. I know he's been, I still find him funny, although he's problematic because Louis C.K. and all that stuff that we've heard about houseplants and stuff. He had this joke about getting his kid a puppy and how happy they were, and all he could do is see it as a ticking time bomb of sadness, because in 15 years the dog is going to die, right? And the child will be very, very sad, even though you're so happy when they're alive. And I say this as a lifetime dog owner, right? So there's this idea that, the birth of Jesus is a ticking time bomb of sadness, in that eventually that's the reason he's going to die. And if we look at the main scene, you'll notice that instead of wearing blue, which is the norm at the Annunciation, her faithfulness to his mission, she's wearing red, which is a symbol of her knowledge of his suffering, right? And that is picked up by the fact that we can actually see the cross as he's coming through the window. Other nifty details in this tight little compartment, which looks like a 15th century Flemish house. She's got this piece of furniture that we still have examples of. It's a flip back bench, and you can see it's on a hinge just behind her head, so that she can flip the back that way when she sits at the table, and she can flip it the other way to sit by the fire. Right? So whoop, goes to the other side. You don't have to move the furniture around, right? Just walk around to the other side. And in the fireplace, we have the andirons there. We have those little sculptures on either side. And we've got a soot in the fireplace. And there's a screen there to protect her from the sparks, right? And it's very similar to the screen we saw behind Jean de Berry in the Très Richer, where he's sitting by the big fire, right? So in fireplaces, we now wire mesh things, right? When you got a fire screen, right, in front of your fire. Actually, now these days we use natural gas and there are no sparks. But still, if you're actually lighting a real fire, you put up a metal fire screen. But back in the day, you had these pieces of wood, right, with the holes to allow the heat through, but would then protect you from the fire. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting. Well, even more interesting, I should say, because I think all of this is kind of fascinating. If we look in the right-hand panel, who is this guy? Joseph the carpenter, right? And you can see him, he's in his carpentry shop, and in fact, it's kind of dirty. It's, I don't have details, but around his feet are a bunch of wood chips. You see an axe there for forming things out of a piece of wood, a little stool to put his feet on, a saw, some more knives, and wood carving tools on his desk. And again, tipped up, right? We're looking straight down on top of it, even though we're going to kind of look across at him, so we can see it well. And he's making something very similar to that fire screen, but smaller, right? And what he's making, we think, is probably a foot warmer. It's kind of the same idea. You get a metal box, hinge the top, put the wood in over the top hinge, and you put some nice warm coals from the fire in there. And then when it's nice and cold outside, you put it underneath your robe, and you put your feet on top of the wood because that doesn't transmit heat nearly so bad, and heat comes through it's nice, right? And it's sort of a safe way. So he's making the top of a fire screen for a foot warmer, and he's ticked off where the holes are going to go. He's making the thing that we see in the inside, but smaller. Although someone once said, and I think this is kind of jokingly, but I still think it's very funny, is that Joseph, of course, has to leave her alone. She has to remain a virgin, and so what's he doing? Drilling holes in a board, right? Because he can't, right? Pre-Freudian sexual frustration, right? The point of it is not so much that, although I still giggle when I think of that. The point of it is not so much that. The point of it is that he's making something that stands between you and fire, right? And we're meant to get the impression that he's already made something like that the one in the central panel is something he made as well. He's a carpenter, right? Where's she going to go get her wooden stuff? But from Sugar Daddy, right? And so, if we think about the fact that he's making this thing that stands between us and fire, that's his whole role as Jesus' stepdad, is to stand between the Virgin Mary and fire. Because as a single pregnant woman in the first century, right, in Bethlehem, to be that would have brought her great criticism and ostracized her from society. So Joseph, his whole role in the Holy Family is basically to complete the family unit, to let out people outside think, well, this pregnancy is normal. Even though the Virgin Mary and Joseph know it's not. Right? To protect her from scorn, from judgment. And so the things that he's making are things that actually relate to that activity. Now he's also got other things he's been making. This is reacting very slowly. On the table and outside are mouse traps. And you can see the one on the table kind of looks like a mouse trap, right? They're a baited mouse trap. And each one of them a sort of different model of a mouse trap. This is also with strong symbolic significance. Jesus, in medieval theology, was called the bait in the mousetrap for Satan. If you think about how a mousetrap works, right, you give the mouse something it wants, cheese, and when the mouse goes for the thing that it wants, it brings about its own death. Jesus, fully human, tempted Satan to kill him, right, or have him killed. And when Satan does that, he brings about his own downfall. Right? So there's an analogy between the incarnation of Jesus, right, him becoming fully human, and the bait in a mousetrap. Right? And Joseph's playing a role in it, right? as part of the Holy Family, and they're making references to it in the things that we see here. Even with the nails in the bowl, right? It's carpentry nails, but that gives you again a reminder of Christ on the cross, right? All these wonderful details. Okay, so the kind of details we saw in Van Eyck are not unique to Van Eyck, right? That is how artists in the 15th century are approaching painting in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands, Flanders, right? They're moving away from the International Gothic style by taking some elements that were there, realism, and pushing them further toward this closely observed form of realism. Now, Campan's realism is slightly different than Van Eyck. Van Eyck loves shiny things. Van Eyck loves jewels and glass and crystals, right? And gold. And Van Eyck, or Campan's is much more mundane. He likes wood and stone. And this might have something to do with their different social situations. Campan was working in the city of Tournai. Remember that Van Eyck was in Bruges and then working in nearby Ghent, right? In Tournai, Robert Campan was a member of the city council, right? He was a civil servant in addition to being a painter. And that sort of down-to-earth job may well be related to his approach to art, which is significantly more down-to-earth than the art of Van Eyck, which is much more heavenly looking, right? Much more mundane. So he works in the city of Tournai, still in the Duchy of Burgundy, closer to the French border, right? Still in Belgium today. In Tournai, he had a huge workshop. Numerous students seem to have been cranking out quite a few images. And in the Tournai city records, there are records of 2 different pupils that he had. One of them was Roger van der Weyden. Learned the craft as an apprentice in Robert Campan's studio in Tournai. Now, this is a place where our history will kind of lie to you. Our Marot triptych, the center panel, is roughly, 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall? Roughly, like 19 inches or so, 19, 20 inches. The deposition on the right is life-size, right? So it's roughly 8, 9 feet across. Right? So just keep that in mind, that if we put these side by side, the Marot altarpiece would come up to about here, next to it, right? But we see them both the same size. Right? Now, as we look at them side by side, there's a slight visual clue to support the idea that Roger van der Weyden was the pupil of Robert Campan. It's difficult to see at first, but once you see it, it becomes very obvious. Now, we know it from documents, right? It doesn't need to be proven further, but if we look at the face of the Virgin Mary, come on. There we go. If we look at the face of the Virgin Mary in these, my computer down here now is going crazy. There we go. You can see that it's basically the same facial structure. Right? Look at the nose, look at the structure of the eyes, look at the sort of moon-faced shape. Right? The difference, of course, is the tonality, because our Virgin has fainted in the deposition, so there's no blood left in her, right? At least in her head. And she's ruddy-cheeked in Robert Campan's because of the difference, right? You can also see a slight difference in that her eyes in Robert Campan's are slightly moving to her right because she's just realizing the angel's there, right? And it's slightly earlier than the other ones where she answers him, right? This is the moment when the angels first come in, and she's just hearing him for the first time, right? So the faces of these support what we know from the documents, that there's something similar in the style of the human figure as handled by Roger van der Weyden and his teacher, Robert Campan. From this same set of documents, we know that in 1432, Roger van der Weyden left that shop to become a painter on his own. and he moved to the city of Brussels, which is strangely not on my map, but it's right between Ghent and Leuven, right where that circle is. And now one of the capitals of the EU, right? The city of Brussels. And in the city of Brussels, Roger became the official city painter for the city of Brussels. Right? That gave him some work insofar as painting some decorations for the town hall, maybe designing dramas for an annual theatrical production, right? Certain work that he would have done for the city, making designs for some sculptures that adorned the city hall. But it also brought him into contact with other cities. And our deposition was made for the city right next door, the city of Leuven. And it was commissioned specifically by the militia guild or military guild of the city of Leuven, who were the crossbowmen. Now, every city had military guilds. They were basically like the National Guard, right? The local police force, if you will. But they were primarily there to protect the city from outside invaders. They really weren't worried about guys who got too drunk and threw up in the streets like cops are, you know, or driving infractions or things like that, right? They were worried about the city being invaded from outside. And most of them had other jobs, but also were part of this elite group of crossbowmen. And when the city came under siege, they would go get their crossbows, where they left them in the chapel, right next to Roger's altarpiece, and would then take them to defend the city. Right? Volunteer fire department, that's a nice analogy, right? The volunteer guys who work the volunteer fire department, who save people's lives, you know, when you do stupid things on the weekend. All of them have other jobs. All of them have real jobs, if you will, and they do this thing for the better of the community. And the crossbowmen are somewhat similar, although it was much more prestigious than that. Right? Now, the crossbowmen of Leuven, the fact that it was made for them, gives us two or three things about this altarpiece that relate directly to them as the patrons. One is that their patron saint, the chapel where they met, where they stored their crossbows, was dedicated to the Virgin of Sorrows. Now, as worship of the Virgin Mary developed through the Middle Ages, and especially toward the end here, late Gothic period, oftentimes groups will be devoted to a particular aspect of the Virgin Mary, a particular character trait. Our Lady of the Miracle of the Snows, for example, something like that, right? There's a group in Bruges that was dedicated to Our Lady of the Snows. They're dedicated to the Virgin of Sorrows. And there was, in the 15th century, the development of a series of devotions to the 7 different sorrows of the Virgin. 7 times she felt extreme pain in her heart because of what was happening to Christ. Right? And because they're devoted to the Virgin of Sorrows, you'll notice that the altarpiece, the deposition, is in fact one of the 7 sorrows. And it focuses on her sorrow. We see her fainting at the moment that Christ is lowered from the cross. So as he comes down from the cross, she falls down to the ground. Right? As he dies, she faints. Parallels, right? And we see her sorrow. That becomes the theme that runs through the entire picture, is sorrow. The sorrow felt by the Virgin, but reflected in the other followers of Christ. Right? Also, in the corners, in this painted tracery of this fake box in which this whole thing takes place, little crossbows. Right? And there's one in each of the corners. So there's another one over here. And there's ones up above, I think, here and here as well. I've never seen this. It's in Madrid. I've never been in it. Everybody that's ever been has told me that they can't believe I've never been, because I like this stuff so much. And apparently this plays really fantastic live because it's so big, right? Like it just has that kind of impact. So There is the crossbow in the corner, in the upper right corner, and this is another way in which the crossbowmen of Leuven had an impact on what Roger painted, right? The sorrow of the Virgin is reflected everywhere, and for Roger van der Weyden, every bit as good at detail as Jan van Eyck. He uses that detail to emphasize emotions, to emphasize expressiveness, where again, Van Eyck kind of likes shiny stuff, pretty things. Roger focuses on tears. And every one of the people is crying prodigiously, right? Their eyes are red, the tears run off their nose, down their cheeks, off their lips. He still gives us other nifty little details, like the pin holding together the top of her shawl, right? Teeth in her mouth, very similar to what Van Eyck had done. But where light passes through something clear, it's the tears. Run down everybody's cheeks. And each person approaches sadness in a different way. The Wi-Fi in here is really being cruddy today. I don't know what's going on here. I'm trying to get from picture to picture. There we go. There's St. John the Evangelist, and I don't know what's going on over there. But you can see his eyes are also, I notice even up around his eyebrows, he's been rubbing his eyes with his hands, right? And you can see where he's made his face red from this. And again, as we dive in close, the focus on those tears, even though he's got a bit of stubble right on his chin, and still painting things hair by hair, what he's doing is he's using the realism of Northern art to emphasize this interest in sorrow. Right? There's Nicodemus with his tears, and again, the redness inside. Look how even with his proper left eye, the one on your right, you can see how the tears welled up even inside the eye, right, just on the top of the lid as it spills out over and down his cheeks. On the far right, Mary Magdalene. We know she's Mary Magdalene because her belt says Jesus Maria on it. So she's Mary Magdalene, right? Feels herself that close to him to have had somebody make them a belt, make her a belt with both names on it. But also, she used to be a prostitute, so she's got a little cleavage, right? Whereas the Virgin Mary is all bundled up right up underneath her chin, right? So that reminds us of her past life. And also, I read somewhere once that this tight-fitting green bodice with the red sleeves was actually the kind of costume worn by prostitutes in the 15th century. So it all helps us to remember where she came from, right? The past that she had prior to this point. And we saw, I think, with Giotto, that she was at the feet of Christ, which is the place she almost always appears at the crucifix, at his feet, because that helps the viewer remember the time that when he was alive, she wiped his feet with oil using her hair, right? So helping to drive home the point of the story. But the focus remains this stupid, ridiculous, okay, now try it. There we go. Focus remains the Virgin Mary. And we can see the skull and the bones from the fact that this is the place of the skull, Golgotha. Even though Roger has taken the setting and he's made it artificial, right? There's no sort of deep background to distract us, right? He wants us to focus on this group of figures that look like they're on a stage almost, acting for us. But she's the focus. And you'll notice that as he's done this, as he's working on her sorrow in reaction to Christ, that not only does he place their hands immediately next to each other, her pale, soft skin next to his scabbed, wounded hand, right? To drive home that point that there's this connection between the two of them. But over and above that, and hoping this is going to work now, their poses are the same, right? As she faints, she falls into the exact same pose that Christ has. So it's this connection between what she's feeling inside and, of course, what he's feeling outside. Fainting and death. Pain in the heart, pain in the flesh. Compassion compassion for his passion, right? The passion of Christ. And somebody pointed this out only about 4 or 5 years ago at a fairly recent exhibition of Rogers' works in Leuven, that they look like crossbows. Do you see that now? The bodies, right? The arms are the arch of the bows, and I never really thought of that before because I was so taken up with the fact that they just paralleled each other. But I love that idea that for the crossbowmen's guild, we get the bodies actually looking like crossbowmen or crossbows. Now, the work became incredibly popular. There's like 250 different copies of this over the next 2 centuries, right, in various media. And up in the Walters, we have a sculptural group that's obviously based directly on this, right? Look at the body of Christ, the people holding it. Oddly, Mary Magdalene's missing, but the rest of it obviously is borrowed directly from this. And so it's one of our few works locally where we can talk about this because it's one of those, like I said, hundreds of works that turn back to Rogers' elegant solution, right, to this problem. Originally, these were polychrome. They were painted. I could only find one picture of them with the original paint to show you when I was up at the Walters last. They weren't out on display. But you can see that with the painting, they become even that much more close to Rogers' work, where the figure holding the shoulders of Christ has got the same sort of red hat, right, that our figure does. So Rogers' work became this sort of touchstone for artists everywhere. Now we've got a pair of Roger van der Weyden's here in DC, and we looked at this when we did the bibliography exercise. We looked at it very briefly then. This wonderful little St. George and the Dragon, and again, the lies of art history. This painting, right, if it were placed next to that one, is absolutely tiny, right? The postcard in the gift shop is bigger than the painting. Okay, it is absolutely, and so what that tells us, right? There's no way that this was put on our church wall anywhere, right? This is something that somebody would have carried around with them, preciously, right? A tiny object for personal devotions. And St. George, as a militiaman, as a soldier dressed in armor, this was probably made for another military guild, one dedicated to St. George. Right? And Roger, we know, has those connections. There's a painting exactly the same size in Madrid. Used to be in Switzerland, now it's in Madrid. And we used to think that they went side by side as a diptych. Right? Fold them up, open them up. You can pray to the Virgin Mary, and you see on your left your patron saint, St. George, right? Just recently, we've done, I had nothing to do with it, right? The scholarly community has done studies with X-ray on the wood panel it's painted on. And lo and behold, the same crack appears in both of them at opposite sides. Which means that originally, instead of being like this was one panel painted on both sides. And they've sawn it down the middle to get 2 paintings to sell instead of 1. Right? So, and where the crack is, I have to go back and look at the catalog to show you exactly where that is. So then we have a Virgin Mary, kind of a very, again, Ike-looking one with all of the details. And keep in mind the scale, right? This is absolutely tiny. And then with our picture on the other side, right? And they were back together again. We borrowed the one on the right in 2006. And made a trip to DC to sit next to this one on the same wall for that study. But in this, we see St. George killing the dragon. This is one of these Christian stories that has, for lack of a better word, fallen on hard times. Like a lot of our saints' legends are fairly easy to buy into, but killing a dragon pushes it a bit too far for people. Just like St. Christopher being a giant who shuffles people across the water, becomes a little harder to buy into. It's different if they're raising people from the dead, right? That's all right. You know, but killing a dragon is just too far. But there he is, and he's got the dragon, he's got the armor. We can see the very shiny armor, kind of Van Eyck-like with the reflections in it. We can also see, I love has on the hip part of his armor these sort of rings, right? And then the dragon's got these shiny scales, and they've kind of got the same thing going on, right? So there's this kind of interesting symbiosis between he, the sage who kills the dragon, and his prey, and the dragon looking back up at him, right, and howling at him. And the whole point is that he's going to save this young maiden who was sacrificed by the people of the town to the dragon, right? And George says, this is crazy, you know, why don't you just kill the dragon instead? Well, we can, and I'll do it for you, right? And so he will then save her, take her back to the city intact. And so what we have in the background is, again, what looks like a 15th century city, just like we saw in Robert Campin, just like we saw in Jan van Eyck, but not through a window. And this is not only to make it relevant to viewers in 1432, right, but also to suggest that this is the town from which she came, right? And this is sort of the wild wilderness in the foreground, where these strange things happen, and in the background, life just kind of goes on. Now we saw the scale, right? Fold your note paper in half, and that's how big this thing is. But it doesn't mean it skimps on the details. They're pretty fantastic, right? So we see this castle up above. We see people in the windows of the castle. We see people moving up the trail to the gateway in the castle. And each one of those has just got to be maybe just flecks of paint, right? Just the tiniest little red flecks to make those figures. And then they come down and we see them moving across a bridge, and there's an inn with flags on it, a little guy talking to someone at the door, a couple looking over the edge of the bridge, taking a moment to look at the water. I love the fact that all the figures you see walking along the quayside there are reflected in the water as well, right? This house here has got brass pots hanging outside of it. We think it might be an apothecary, because that's where you would go get bloodletted, or get your blood let for medical treatment, and they would often display the pots. They knew where to go. A beautiful church here, right? Figures moving up the street to the church. As we move further back, we see figures coming across this way, and a little wicker fence around the tilled yard, a woman in a little French door looking out of her house. Back in the background, figures crossing another bridge, and again reflected in the water, coming to a crossroads, and there's a cross in the crossroads there at the edge of the walled city, and then as we move our way back into the landscape. And again, keep in mind scale, right? This detail that we're looking at back here is probably like this in real life. And into the distance, boats sort of sail on into the sunset. Life goes on normally. Another city right at the next lagoon back. Life goes on normally despite the craziness we see in the foreground, right? With this, we're going to leave Northern Europe behind and turn back to Italy for a while. So what we were looking at when we looked at Northern Europe is that we saw that the move from the International Gothic, remember, International Gothic is everywhere. It sort of comes out of Siena, right? Because Simone Martini goes to Avignon in France. From Avignon it spreads to Paris, from Paris it spreads everywhere, right? And in the 15th century, right, we find artists like Van Eyck using oil paint to enhance the level of detailing in the International Gothic style and achieve something that's very, very different from that, right? We don't really call it Renaissance, even though it's Renaissance era, because Renaissance means rebirth, particularly rebirth of ancient Rome. And there's nothing being reborn in Jan van Eyck's work. And there certainly is nothing Roman about it. Nothing ancient, right? So this is why historians prefer the term late Gothic. Okay? What we're going to see as we look at Italy is they too are going to be moving away from the International Gothic style, but they're going to move away from it in a different direction. So at the same time that Van Eyck is enhancing details, the Italians are going to be doing something different, right? But both of them are breaking with the International Gothic tradition. So remember that International Gothic was everywhere, right? It wasn't just up north. It spread from Siena into France, from France into the Low Countries, into Germany. We didn't look at it, but France and Spain, or excuse me, England and Spain as well. It also stayed home. And even in the beginning of the 15th century, we see in works like Gentile da Fabriano a continuation of the international Gothic style into the 15th century. So this is a huge altarpiece. There was a predella down below, but the Italians don't like triptychs, so there were no wings, right? Just the main panel. And it shows the gold background of the International Gothic style. It shows the landscape tipped up almost to the top of the panel. It shows a great interest in bright colors. And certainly it's got some details, but you would never mistake it for a young Van Eyck, because he's still using tempera paint. And the overall effect is one of sumptuousness, but not necessarily of that blinding interest in three-dimensional details. We've got a Gentile da Fabriano here. It's not as good an example, but I thought I'd show it to you anyway from the National Gallery, where you can see the gold background very similar to what Giotto had been doing 100+ years earlier. Christ and the Virgin Mary in these bright robes sitting on these nicely decorated throne with flowers on it. She's got her collar is decorated with the word mother. It says mater right there, and that's what he's touching, right? Touching the word mother. Which is nice. And then the hem of her garment, it says Ave Maria, and then it goes on to the words of the angel of the Annunciation, Gratia Plena, right? All of that. And Jesus has a little butterfly on a string, and butterflies were seen as symbols of the resurrection, because caterpillar, nest, butterfly, right? And that was like Jesus' tomb resurrection, right? So these are really quite charming little things. Right? So these are both International Gothic style still, right, in the early 15th century. I want to look at the Strozzi altarpiece and talk about sort of this legacy of Duccio. And you remember the Maestà altarpiece, the nativity from that, how he stages the birth of Christ in this grotto that's built inside a cave. Look at how the mountains are handled in particular. And look at the mountains right behind Joseph and the ox in the Strozzi altarpiece. My undergraduate prof called them cheese cut mountains. I like the idea. It's like a big piece of Parmesan that's been, hacked off. And Mary's still there. Joseph is with her. The midwives are there again. And just to compare apples to apples, there's the nativity from the Maestà, right? And so you can see that this is really kind of a similar conception, with the exception of the fact that Gentile da Fabriano's is much more crowded, full of details. And that's part of it is the scale, right? Remember that this is part of the predella, and it's only about like this, right? The Strozzi altarpiece is huge, right? Meant to be seen from a distance. So it shows the Magi, the three wise men coming to see Christ after his birth. What do they share in common? What can you see as similarities between the two? In subject matter, in style? Anything at all? Do any poses repeat? Do any figures repeat?
Kneeling.
One, okay, up here, one kneeling, right? So one of the three kings is kneeling down, right? Literally right in front of Christ is on the ground. The other two are standing. In the Strozzi altarpiece, you'll notice he takes that kind of a step further. One stands, one's about to kneel, and one's on the ground, which is kind of nice. It gives you a sense of time elapsing, right? That each one's going to follow suit. You notice anything else about the kneeling wise man? Sorry? He's kissing Jesus' foot, right? And in each one of them, Jesus reaches out to him as well. In the Strozzi altarpiece, he touches him on the head, right? But in Duccio's, he's just sort of reaching up toward him, right? He's reacting to that. But he's kissing Jesus' foot. This is kind of interesting when we think about it being an altarpiece, right? You see each of these in the context of taking communion. And when you take communion, you take the body of Christ And the oldest Magus, right, is taking the body of Christ to his mouth. Now, it's not some sort of zombie apocalypse cannibalistic sort of thing, right? He's not going to eat it. But the fact that he's kissing it is an analogy to you receiving the sacrament. Right? Other things. From the obvious to the less obvious. Ox and the ass. Are they there? They're not, are they? They've been added here from the Nativity. Right? Three magi. You notice anything about the three magi? Three wise men. In each of the two pictures. I already sort of alluded to this.
They're all like holding something.
They're all holding something. That comes right out of the Bible, right? Each one of them brought a gift. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right, to the infant Jesus. And so we see that. What's interesting is the Bible doesn't tell us how many wise men there were, but the fact that there were three gifts, it kind of became common that there were three wise men, right? And you can see that there are three of them in each of these. Once Christianity sort of pared it down and codified this idea that there are three of them, the use of the three became not the Trinity, but something else. This is meant to represent the coming of all of the world to see Christ, to kneel before him. And so the three magi came to represent all of the three ages of man. And you'll notice that in each one of them, each of the wise men is a different age. So in each of them, the oldest goes first. That's the way it should be, I say now. That I'm older, right? The oldest goes first, kneels down. The next one has a beard, right? And the third one is clean shaven, softer skin, right? So we have youth, maturity, and old age. The three ages of man. So the idea of this is that they're meant to symbolize everyone coming. It's a patriarchal society, ladies. You know, it's all through men, right? And eventually, they're also meant to represent the three known parts of the world. So we end up finding them representing Europe, Asia, Africa. And it's not until the end of the 15th century that we actually see dark-skinned, one of them become a dark-skinned Magus. Right? So they are intended to represent all of the world. Right? There are other kind of subtle things here. Camels, because they've come from afar. Right? So we have the camels in the back on the left, and we'll see some details on the right where we see camels as well. Look at the horses that belong to the Magi in Duccio's picture. They're each being held by grooms. Right? There's three horses. They're black, brown, and white. Again, right, let's overemphasize this whole thing. But look at the two in the foreground. What's going on with them? These happy horses? They're glaring at each other. Right? They're looking around the grooms, and their eyes are just buggy as they're staring at each other. This goes back to a legend that the Magi, coming from different lands, none of this is in the Bible, right? This is legendary. That the Magi, coming from different lands, were actually enemies to begin with. And it was the common purpose of seeing Christ that made them unite, that brought peace. Because the whole message of the birth of Christ is he's here to bring peace to the world. Right? So the idea of the angry horses is also picked up by Gentile de Fabriano 100 years later. We'll see details of this. Lots of details of Christ bringing peace to the world. So he's taking on these traditional elements that repeat and then pushing them a step further. So look at those horses in the foreground. Isn't that great? Right? They're really having at each other, right? And the little groom in the middle is going to whip him. You see him with the bald head, Bobby Hill. Is that a reference to anybody anymore? It's been off the air for a long time, right? Bought it. something wrong with the boy, and he's gonna knock him back a bit. And our horses are meant to represent different parts of the world. So there we have the crescent moon, right, from the Islamic flag, right, there as well, and then amazing animals, right, exotic animals, the cheetahs with them as well. And of course they're angry. There's a cheetah there, you know. But another one back here, and even the birds are fighting, right? And this guy's looking up at the fighting birds up above. So the idea that Christ is coming to bring peace is a traditional element that John Tilly de Fabriano includes in his work. I love all of the great animals here. There's our donkey, right? And monkeys riding on the back of the donkey, right? Adding to this sense that they've come from these far off and exotic places. Come on, come to Papa. There we go. The midwives taking the gifts, Joseph leaning in, having a bit more to do with things. Poor old Joseph, right? The fate of Joseph kind of waxes and wanes through time. And here he's got a little bit more to do than he normally does. And there's Jesus got a hand right on the top of the bald head of the guy. And our midwives back here are still there. But again, remember, they're not there in the Bible. They're just traditionally part of this image. Wonderful brocading, right? We saw that with Simone Martini and his work coming into the international. There's this interest in patterns of fabric. And you'll notice that those patterns don't really follow the three dimensions of the figures. Look at the red robe of the old Magus in the foreground. And you can see that the pattern seems almost like it's flat again, right? It doesn't actually fold over his back as it goes there. And ditto for the guy on the right, the young Magus. But again, there's this amazing interest in expensive, beautiful fabrics. And that great detail of his page, helping him to take his stirrups off. Now that he's come in front of Christ, you're done riding. Now you can take those off. This interest in luxury would have appealed to the man who paid for this. The Strozzi altarpiece refers to Palla Strozzi, who was the one who paid for this to go into his family chapel in Florence. And in the 1420s, Palla Strozzi was the wealthiest man in the entire city. Easily, right? And in fact, he was the enemy of the Medici family, who you remember from your worksheet. And in fact, Cosimo de' Medici got him kicked out of town around 1430. At which point the Medici family actually took this work into their own collection. But it was originally commissioned by Palla Strozzi. So this is why I refer to it as the Strozzi altarpiece. Right? And the luxuriousness that we see would have definitely appealed to him. In the background, we see the Magi story extended into the past. How did they get here? So here we see the three Magi first encountering the star. Standing on the top of the hill, there's the star in the sky. I'm sorry, I don't have a better detail of this. But they're about to move on their journey. We see the same horses that we see in the foreground. We see some of the monkeys. And they're going to move across this path. And John Tilly de Fabriano gives us these details that show us that war is everywhere. This guy getting mugged. Right? You can see the guy's got on his face. They're stealing his money. So danger is really very much everywhere. And in the central panel, trying, would be going a lot faster if this would behave. There we go. The Magi's entourage, there they are in the middle. 1, 2, 3 horses, 1, 2, 3 halos, right? Working their way back to a city, and we see them moving to another city in the right-hand panel. But here is that entourage coming from who knows where. I love the cheetahs balancing precariously on the backs of the horses here as they move their way through. One of them has gotten out and is killing a deer in the landscape. This one's running away, right? So you're mauling them as they move through. And then there's our hunting birds as well. And I'm assuming that if we could see this better, we could see more fighting horses and maybe find the monkeys in there somewhere too. Right? So International Gothic style, right? A kind of elaborate way of talking about that. That already, even by the 1420s, the International Gothic style is still going pretty strong. in Italy. But what we see during that exact same decade is that the Italians moved away from it too. Right? Just as Van Eyck had moved away from it up north. But the difference is how they move away from it. For Masaccio, his exit from the International Gothic style is a unified conception of space, achieved through the use of one-point perspective. Accurate, mathematical, measured space. Now, this system was only devised in around 1415 and wasn't actually published until 1435. And you might remember this from your worksheet, where Brunelleschi, an architect by trade, came up with this new system for rendering space. It seems as if it spread by word of mouth. And the only people who know about it at first are people who live in Florence. And then after 1435, when it's published, it gets more widespread as a system that artists use to create space that we still make you do today, right, in drawing classes. So we'll look at that in just a second. That's one of the ways that Masaccio shifts away from the International Gothic style. I got a bit ahead of myself. There we go, sorry. In that, another way that Masaccio moves from the International Gothic style is he looks more closely at ancient Roman art. Now, the Renaissance has always been about the rebirth of ancient Rome, right? From the get-go. And for Giotto and Duccio, all it meant, the only thing they got from Roman art was realism, modeling in 3 dimensions. For Masaccio, what we see is he starts to look at figure types, anatomy, bodies, muscles. And so our man at the right in the red tunic, which is 15th century style, is male miniskirt, right? Is a 15th century style. We see him again in the middle. You can almost see some cheek, right? But you'll see the pose where he rests most of his weight on his right leg, and then his left leg is slack, right? Is very similar to the pose of the statue that we see here, which is the first Caesar, Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, right? A statue that stood at the main gate into Rome, the Prima Porta. And if we look at the way that the body is articulated from the waist down, it's the same, right? One leg locked, the other leg relaxed. Right? And with the Prima Porta, one arm is active, the other one is relaxed. And that's sort of true in Masaccio's as well. One reaches out to get something from the other man, and the other one's sort of resting on that post, right? And you'll notice that the post arm balances out against the leg. It's all a system of counterbalances with the post. Masaccio is looking back at ancient Rome for more than just chiaroscuro, for more than just rendering things in 3 dimensions. Glad class is almost over. He's looking back for this body type, right? This hyper-muscular, always fit. The Olympics are on. It's nice to talk about this, right? Always fit. That the Italians called contrapposto, counterpoised, counterbalanced, where one part is flexed and the other part is relaxed. That gives it a sense of stasis. So Masaccio is definitely looking back at ancient sculpture. The other way we know that he's looking back at ancient sculpture is that he gives us the same pose twice. It's the same figure. The story plays out in 3 different scenes. The same guy in the same clothes is in the middle, with the same locked leg, resting leg, but seen from the back. Almost as if Masaccio is saying, yes, I know this came from sculpture. You can see it in 3 dimensions, right? You can see it from the front and the back. And that points to something that was common in the Renaissance, which is that the group of sculptors said that sculpture was better, and the group of painters said that painting was better. And each had their arguments about this, right? Because very few people did both. Michelangelo was one of the few, but very few people would do both, right? And what the painters said is, hey, we can do settings, right? We can do landscape. We can put the figures into a context. The sculptor said, yeah, but I can show them in 3 dimensions, right? And that became known, that sort of friendly back and forth. Became known as the paragone, right? Think of the word paragon, right? You're putting forth the virtue of your own thing, right? The paragone between sculptors and painters. And we'll talk about this again because it comes up with Italian Renaissance art a lot. Which of these two is better? And Masaccio is painting in a way that he suggests that he's as good as sculpture, right? Painting is as good as sculpture. Now, the other thing we were talking about, and we'll end with this, is the idea of using perspective. 1-point perspective, which was a system that Brunelleschi came up with around 1415, and Alberti published in 1435. Quite a bit, right? It's not ripping it off. But put it into print. And that basically says that all parallel lines will recede in space to a single point on the horizon. Right? Like standing on railroad tracks or in the middle of a highway. Not that you should stand on railroad tracks in the middle of a highway, right? But if you're in this room, standing here, right? I can imagine the walls coming together and eventually meeting at a point, right? So all parallel lines will meet at a point on the horizon, right? And Brunelleschi, published by Alberti, came up with a very elaborate system for doing this. And I'm not going to really go into this. Vanishing point, orthogonals are the things that recede. It's all based on the proportions of mankind. And the bottom line is that once you realize the system, I did this sort of just with PowerPoint, you realize that if one, all parallel lines recede to points, it becomes very easy to draw 3-dimensional objects, right? Because the parallel lines of the sides will recede to the point C on the horizon. We can imagine them, right, going all the way back to that point. Right? Then we just erase the other parts, and we've got ourselves a box. So with this idea, right, if we look at Masaccio's tribute money, you'll notice that while we're outside, we have this building on the right. And the building gives us the facade of the building with a porch, which means that we have a series of parallels, don't we? Right? A complex box. So this face here with the arch is parallel to this face, is parallel to the steps, right? Parallel to the part in the back here. And if he's using 1-point perspective, all of these lines, the top and the bottom, should recede to the same point, as should the others. And lo and behold, it works. And the fascinating thing is, since you can put the vanishing point anywhere, Masaccio chooses to put it at Christ's head. Because what happens when you look at it is your eye automatically kind of does that psychologically, right? It actually draws your eye to the face of Jesus. I'm sorry we're a bit late, but one last thing. For all of the realism of Van Eyck, he did not have a perspective system, right? At least not a unified one. The floor tiles should be parallel to the left wall. They should all come to the same vanishing point, and he's figured it out optically in certain parts, but it doesn't work consistently. And if you were to trace the tops of these columns here, you realize that it would come kind of over this way somewhere, right? It just doesn't work. But that doesn't make it any less realistic. It's a different system, right? So for the Italians, again, right, the difference between this International Gothic style is more Roman bodies, 1-point perspective, and both of these things are based on rationality rather than observing details. This lays the stone for where Italian Renaissance art will go and how it differs from what's happening up north. Right. Sorry for being 2 minutes late here. On Thursday, we'll continue with 15th century Italy. We will then get to 16th century next week, and probably have the next worksheet due a week from today, right? In fact, I'll go home and email you that. Right? So if you want to start working, or if you're like Valerie, way ahead of the game, you're set to go, right? But those will be due next week.